Coele-Syria is another name for Israel, another name for Judea, another name for Iudaea, another name for Judea, another name for Palestine, another name for Levant. All these different names, it's all that same little chunk of land right there that's modern-day Israel. Now, I'm very focused on that little piece of Israel. But we have to be careful doing that because there's a lot of stuff going on in the world that was not just in Israel at the time. This is week number 3 of our study of the Intertestament period, or week 3 of 946, the way it's going right now. We're kind of much slower than I anticipated being from the very beginning. First of all, a big thank you to our friend Kenny Loy here up front. He has done an amazing job of videoing this class and editing and putting everything on YouTube for us. He is my encourager-in-chief. He's done a tremendous amount of work. And I just can't thank him enough for everything he's done. In fact, I told him the other day, I said, you probably know about more about my class than I do. So if you have any questions, please come see Kenny. He's your guy because he has to go through and edit all this video and fix my boo-boos. It's amazing how many boo-boos I have during class. I say the wrong things, and he goes in and fixes those. My only complaint is he won't make me look like Tom Cruise. I've asked him time and again. He won't do it. I don't know why. But anyway, it's youtube.com/DennySissom. The classes are posted a few days after they're set here. So now you can go and watch them on the streaming channel on the Bethel site, or if you watch them on YouTube, again, we've edited that. We put the charts in full screen so you can see things better, and he's edited out things that are my uhs and my idiot things that I do. And if I say something wrong, we'll put a correction down at the bottom that tries to correct things that I do. So anyway, go check that out at that YouTube channel. So from last week, we covered a lot, actually. But the last thing we covered were differences between canonical, apocryphal, and pseudepigraphal books. Canonical are Bible books. And we talked about the fact that Jews, Muslims, Christians, everyone considers Genesis canonical, right? Everyone believes Abraham, those kind of things. And then there's apocryphal books. And apocryphal books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees are very good historically, but they're not canonical to us as Christians. Well, Protestants, including the Church of Christ, do not consider apocryphal books canonical books. Okay, but some do. Roman Catholics consider 12 out of the 18 apocryphal books. Oh, I'm talking about Old Testament apocrypha. They consider 12 out of the 18 Old Testament apocryphal books as canonical. And then there's pseudepigraphal, where no one believes they're canonical at all. Okay? We also briefly touched on the life and works of Flavius Josephus, who was a Jew, a commander of the Galilean forces during the Roman War, and he turned traitor, and he became a patron of the Emperor Vespasian. And boy, oh boy, good thing he survived, because we have so much history because of this man Josephus. He brought us antiquities of the Jews and wars of the Jews. Okay, so let's finish up our talk very quickly of the different writings that appeared in intertestament times. Now this is quick. One slide, boom, 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 just like that, going through these. We're going to pick these up in more detail later on, 4 months or so from now probably, when we talk about writings of the period. But start out with the pseudepigrapha, known as false writings, pseudo-false, right? Pseudepigrapha, false writings. Not accepted as canonical by anyone. Many are rewriting of history in the form of prophecy. So nobody considers those canonical. The Septuagint, it was a translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. It was the work used by Jesus and the apostles when they quote from the Old Testament Bible. They used the Greek Septuagint. Some of our Septuagint manuscripts, there's a couple in the British Museum that I've seen. There's one in the Vatican I've not seen, but those have they have the Apocrypha in them, but I don't think, from what I've read and studied about this, it doesn't look like the original Septuagint had the Apocrypha in it. But these translations, these old codexes in the two museums that I mentioned do have some of the Apocryphal books in there. The Mishnah. It's the compilation of the oral law. You hear about in the New Testament all the time, the oral law, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, blah, blah, blah. We see about that all the time in the New Testament. Well, the oral law is the Mishnah. It is the written oral law. Kind of a disconnect there a little bit, but it is the written oral law. The Gemara is a commentary on the Mishnah. There's two of them. There's a Jerusalem Gemara and a Babylonian Gemara. The Babylonian is considered the more authoritative of the two, but it's a commentary on the Mishnah. If you combine those two, you get the Talmud. You've probably heard this term before, the Talmud. The Talmud is a combination of the Mishnah and the Gemara. There is a Babylonian Talmud and a Jerusalem Talmud. The Mishnah is the same in both those, but the commentaries are different. I have up here a copy of the Babylonian Talmud. Pretty small print. Now I'm fooling you actually, because this is one volume of 22. If you do Talmud study, you have a lot to study. This is the Babylonian, this particular volume is just about the Sanhedrin. Now I picked up about, I think, a half a dozen of these over time because they were sets that were broken up. I couldn't afford the whole Babylonian Talmud, and plus it'd take up an awful lot of room on my bookshelf to have 22 volumes of that. The Tosefta is a supplement to the Mishnah. The Torah has three different definitions. First of all, depending on the context, depending on who's talking, whatever. First of all, some people consider the Torah the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Also known as the Pentateuch. Penta, 5 in Greek. That's one definition of Torah. Another definition is the entire Hebrew Bible. Another definition is the entire Hebrew Bible and the Mishnah. Of course, we as Christians don't consider that the Torah, right? But some Jews consider the Torah the combination of the whole Bible and the Mishnah. Targumim, that's plural for Targum, are paraphrases, translations, free renderings, interpretations of Hebrew scriptures in different languages, Aramaic, Chaldaic, Greek, Syrian, whatever. Okay? Think of, in our English language, the Message. Any of you have the Message in your library? I do. It is a free rendering of Scripture. I can go read that, and it's very English, easy to read. You know, it's an easy-to-read version of the Bible. So it puts it in very today English, called the Message. I would consider that a Jewish equivalent as a Targum or Targum. The Midrashim are synagogue sermons written in both Hebrew and Aramaic. They are broad interpretations of the biblical text. The Midrashim to us today would be like a translation or a writing down of one of Jimmy's sermons. That would be a Midrashim today to the Jews. The Tanakh is simply the Hebrew Bible, or to us, the Old Testament. And it's the same as the second definition of Torah, back up here, right here. The second definition of the entire Hebrew Bible is the Tanakh. Tanakh is actually 3 different syllables. T stands for Torah, N stands for Nevi'im, I forget exactly what it is, and the CH sound stands for something else. Well, anyway, we'll cover that when we get to it in a few weeks. So that's quickly the writings of the period. Now let's talk about the languages of the period. Well, people who know 3 languages are trilingual, people who know 2 languages are bilingual, and people who know 1 language are Americans. Yeah. If you read some of the intros and some of the chapters in my book, you'll discover how this American has really embarrassed many Americans for all time because of some of the travels I've done overseas. And it's kind of the fool I made of myself in certain countries, particularly France, when I was talking to the taxi driver. And I'd practice this on the plane all the way over, you know, parlez-vous anglais, do you speak English? And I got in the cab with the guy, we'd actually loaded up all our luggage and everything, and I said, parlez-vous anglais? He said, yeah, I've been speaking English through the whole time, you big dummy. He didn't say the big dummy part, but he wanted to get a tip, I guess. Anyway, I have managed to embarrass all Americans for all time. The 4 languages at the time were Hebrew. Hebrew was kind of out of favor by the time the New Testament started. Aramaic and Greek really started pushing Hebrew out of the picture by the New Testament, really after the Babylonian captivity. Most of the Old Testament, though, is written in Hebrew with smatterings of it in Aramaic. Now remember we talked last week, there's a difference between Aramaic, ancient Aramaic, and Arabic that they talk in the Middle East today. And I mentioned a couple of words last week of Arabic that I picked up when I was over there. Jesus probably knew Hebrew. We don't know for sure. But we do see a couple of examples. In Luke 4, Jesus read from a scroll of Isaiah. Probably in Hebrew. Jesus debated religious leaders of his day, probably in Hebrew. Aramaic now is likely the main language of Jesus and the apostles. A bunch of the words in the New Testament are transliterations of Aramaic words. Talitha Kum, Mark 5. Abba, Mark 14. Eloi, Lema, Sabachthani, we read from the cross. Boanerges, Cephas, Hosanna, Gethsemane, Maranatha, Golgotha, those are all transliterations of Aramaic words into English. So Aramaic was very, very popular in the time of Jesus and the apostles. The writing on the ossuary of Caiaphas was written in Aramaic, not Hebrew, not Greek, not Latin, because Aramaic was very popular. Now, we don't know 100%. We're pretty sure that this is the ossuary of Caiaphas. It's in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And you can go look at it. You can see the writing on the side of that. It's very interesting. By the way, do you know the difference between an ossuary and a sarcophagus? A sarcophagus is like our coffins today. It's where you'd put a full body in a sarcophagus. Okay. Once that body decomposed and there was only bones left, they would take the body parts, the bones, out of the sarcophagus and put them in an ossuary. So an ossuary is a small box. It only has to be this big, right? It has to encompass the long leg bone. So the ossuary is this big. You take the bones and you put them in the ossuary. And they have found an ossuary, very likely of Caiaphas, the high priest. Greek was the main language promulgated by Alexander the Great. Remember, he brought in Hellenism, Greek culture, Greek thinking, Greek ways of life, and Greek language, Hellenism. The primary language of many of the Jews, particularly of the diaspora, or the Jews that were scattered abroad, probably spoken by Jesus because he had some conversations with Pilate, for example, the Roman centurion. They probably spoke Greek. Latin was the official language of the Roman Empire. There's something called a pilot stone that they discovered in Caesarea, particularly Caesarea Maritima, because there were all kinds of cities named Caesarea after all these people would start naming cities after Caesar, Augustus, particularly. But Caesarea Maritima, the one on the coast, the one you can go to today, called Caesarea, and there was that pilot stone found that was written in Latin, the official language of the Roman Empire. Turns out the sign above the cross of Jesus was written in Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. Geography. Jimmy Buffett said, without geography, you're nowhere. I like that. When we study a topic, we tend to become myopic. I do. When I'm studying intertestament history, I am looking just at Coele-Syria. Now, Coele-Syria is another name for Israel, another name for Judea, another name for Iudaea, another name for Judea, another name for Palestine, another name for Levant. All these different names, it's all that same little chunk of land right there that's modern-day Israel. Now, I'm very focused on that little piece of Israel. But we have to be careful doing that because there's a lot of stuff going on in the world that was not just in Israel at the time. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a zoomed-out picture of everything before zeroing in on just Israel. And we're going to look at centuries. We're going to look from 500 to 400. Now, the end of the Old Testament was 425 BC, thereabouts, when Nehemiah finished rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. So this is the century that covers the end of the Old Testament, with the Persians in charge. Now, this is going to be hard to see. Impossible to see, maybe. But I've put the 500 BC one over here and the end of that century over here. This light blue area is the kingdom of Persia. I can't emphasize enough how much of a major kingdom Persia was. And they controlled the Middle East. They controlled Coele-Syria at that time. If you notice the end of the century, Persia is still a major power. Rome is still just a sleepy little town. No one knew Rome was going to burst into such amazingness over time, but they did over time. But Persia was the world power. Now, what I've done, these maps are really neat. These are from worldhistorymaps.com. Thomas Lessman did them. But he didn't animate those. So what I've done is I've animated these. And what I want to show you is how Persia really didn't change any. But I want to show you how kind of around the edges there's some skirmishes going on. So I'm going to go ahead and animate this. And I'm stepping every 5 years. So up here you see the time steps. But you see the kind of at the edges, we see the Greek city-states coming along, and challenging Persia. And boy, did that happen big time later in the next century. So now we start over again, stepping along again. See the Greek city-states here. We see some stuff going on over here in the Far East, in the area where China is going to rise very quickly. But Persia stays pretty much the same. We just have a little stuff at the edges where Persia kind of loses a little territory, gains a little territory, and that kind of thing. The Carthaginian Empire up here in purple, they're starting to grow a little bit. They start taking over the entire northern coast of Africa and on into the southern coast of Spain. They take over the islands of the Italian peninsula. Sardis, Corsica, Sardinia, I forget, Sardis? Anyway, the three islands, you notice that they've taken these islands off the coast of the Italian peninsula. So that is the century in which the Old Testament ended, when Persia was in charge of pretty much the world at that point. Next up, 400 to 300 BC. The world witnessed the total collapse of the Persian Empire. This giant empire that existed then in this century totally collapsed. We see it go from this light blue area to, oh, wow. Where did Persia go? Who lived during that time? Alexander the Great, the greatest general of all time. He totally destroyed this huge empire of Persia. And then when he died, the empire was broken up among his commanders, the Diadochi. And we'll talk about that in great detail later on when we get chapter 3 of the book. So here's an animation of 400 to 300 BC, again stepping in 5-year increments. Notice Persia, this giant empire. Notice the Greek city-states, though, starting to coagulate under Philip. Oh, wow, look at that. Alexander the Great takes over all that, and then he dies. And the whole thing is broken up among his generals. Persia, this great nation, the start of Alexander the Great, he spreads that way in just a few years, takes over everything. He wasn't a very good estate planner, though, and his kingdom was broken up into several places, several chunks, the two of which we are mostly concerned with are the Seleucids, named after his general Seleucid the First, Nicator, I think, and then Ptolemy the First. Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucid in Syria, Seleucus in Syria. Next up, 300 to 200 BC. So we start out with the kingdom broken up. This orange area is Seleucus' empire, or the Seleucids, or Syria, all synonymous. Down here we have the Egyptian Empire. When we get to 100 years later in 200 BC, we see the Seleucid Empire is still about the same. We see the Carthaginian Empire here still exists, but we see Rome starting to come online. By the 200 BC, we see the Roman Republic having taken over the entire Italian peninsula. We see they've spread out to the islands. They've spread out to, where do we go? They spread out some to the northern shore of the Mediterranean. So let's go ahead and step through this. Again, 5 years at a time. With the Seleucid kingdom expand and contract over this time, we see the Bactrian kingdom come online, I think, in this time. We see the Parthian kingdom, I think, come online at this time. Well, we'll see. Maybe the next century. Nope, it's just the next century. But we see Carthage expanding along the coast up into Spain, or having expanded already up there. Rome expanding. Carthage expands into Spain, but then Rome kicks them out. See, turned into Rome right there at the very end of that century. Next up, 200 to 100 BC. In this time, notice the rapid rise of the Bactrian Empire. So here we see the Seleucid Empire, and here we see the Parthian Empire, but we don't see the Bactrian Empire. So it was kind of like a flash in the pan as far as these long timelines kind of go. So the Seleucid Empire basically breaks up into the Bactrian and then the Parthian Empire. And the Parthian Empire is who Herod the Great had to deal with, is who had Mark Antony had to deal with. Some of the stuff in the more recent late Roman Republic, early Roman Empire kind of history. So let's go ahead and step through this particular century. Starting 200 BC, stepping 5 years at a time, Rome starts expanding. Seleucids are broken up into the Bactrian kingdom, and then we have the Parthian kingdom, and then the Bactrian kingdom goes away. The Parthian kingdom gets bigger and bigger by the end of the century of 100 BC. But Rome, that's where the story's at. Rome is basically kicking Carthage out of everywhere. And they're starting to take over this northern coast of Africa. They're taking over the whole Mediterranean basin by 200 or 100 BC. Next up, 100 BC to 1 BC. With the exception of Mauritania, here, Rome, by the time Jesus is born-ish, Rome has taken over the entire Mediterranean basin, including Coele-Syria over here. So let's step through this century. So Parthia still remains a kingdom. Again, we see the Romans have to deal with them on their eastern front. With Herod the Great, had some dealings with the Parthians. In fact, he almost died because of the Parthians. Mark Antony had some skirmishes with the Parthians. So Rome was not where everything was, but there was a lot going on with Rome. See how they're expanding up in here? It's pretty amazing. Notice what's going over here in the Far East, in China. China's been around a long, long time. Now, I don't know anything about China. I don't know anything about the different dynasties or anything like that, but I do know that they were expanding. They were expanding westward while Parthia and Rome was expanding eastward, but they never really clashed or anything. But the story here is Rome, the Roman Republic, up until 27 BC, I think it was, when Octavian became the first Roman emperor. So we have the Roman Republic going into the Roman Empire. Next up, world history from 1 BC to AD 100. Now, if you forget what the islands of Great Britain are, I've put them up here for you. England and Wales are on the main continent. Scotland's to the north, and Ireland is to the west. So Rome ends up taking, if you notice by 100 AD, by the time John on Patmos dies-ish, is the time we're talking about here, 100 AD. So Rome has taken over the entire Mediterranean basin, whereas before they had this little piece that was left, but they have the entire Mediterranean basin, and Parthia is still an empire, and then China's about the way it was from about a century earlier, okay? But Rome ends up taking up here in Britain. They take England, they take Wales. They took England in about 47 BC, 77 AD, sorry. They took Wales. And they briefly controlled Scotland up here in the north, which is hard to see on this map, but then they lost it. And you'll see that in the next animation. So now we're in the ADs. Rome again is expanding. They take Mauritania over here. They expand and take England, Wales. They take Scotland for a minute, and then they lose it. And then that's the end of our animation. So that, my friends, is the entire history of the entire world in 5 or so animations, 6 animations. That's hard to see from where you're sitting. I know that's true. As we go along, I will create other animations of zoomed in places to look at. The World History Maps is really cool that you can zoom in a year at a time, step through history a year at a time. It's just really hard to turn them into animations, I discovered. But anyway, that's the world history view. Now let's start looking at where we're interested in. First of all, we're looking mainly at the Eastern Mediterranean countries. That's our area of interest in this study in the next several weeks. These are the modern Eastern Mediterranean countries. Of course, Israel's there, the Gaza Strip, we all know about in the news, the West Bank, we all know about in the news, is there, Cyprus, Turkey, etc. We then look in and zoom in on the Middle East. Now, in my book, I said there's 17 countries that make up the Middle East, and I thought, well, different people have different definitions of what the Middle East is. So I asked my little AI agent, and I said, what countries are in the Middle East today? And it came back and said, well, there's 17 countries in the Middle East today, and it listed off the names of them, and I said, all right, well, good. That's what I have in my book, so at least my Perplexity AI agrees with me there. And these are the 17 countries that are in the Middle East. There's some countries that we think are the Middle East that are not. according to the general definition. Afghanistan, I kind of always think of as being the Middle East, maybe Turkmenistan, Sudan, maybe Libya, whatever. But these are the countries generally thought of as the Middle East. 17 countries encompassing 2.7 million square miles. And then let's zoom down further into Israel. Israel is a tiny, tiny country. It's about as tall as Alabama. I can drive from the very tippy top in the Golan Heights in Israel to a lot in the same amount of time I can drive from here to Gulf Shores. Small country. The narrowest part of Israel is right here between the West Bank where the word Nablus is. So this little boundary line right there over to the Mediterranean, that's 9 miles. I can drive from here to Providence, and that's about the same width as Israel is. Kind of amazing, little bitty country. Israel is an amazing country. They are 11th in the world in Nobel Prizes per capita. They write 9 times more scientific articles than its share of the global population. They are 13th in scientific output per capita in the world. They have the highest ratio of GDP spent on research and development. When I worked in missile defense, unfortunately, I was not able to work on Israeli missile defense. I did have colleagues that did. They worked on Arrow, which is their high-tier missile defense system against long-range missiles coming from Iran or wherever. But when they worked on that, and they would travel to Israel, and they would sit down with their counterparts in Israel and be working on something. And to Americans, it was kind of like, it's a job. This is just what we do. This is how we get paid. To Israelis, it's like, it's not just a job. This is our existence. And it shows in the kind of stuff that they've done. They are the 5th most innovative country in the world. They have the strongest economy in the Middle East besides Saudi Arabia, and they certainly have the strongest military in the Middle East. Pretty cool for a little bitty country the size, about half the size of Alabama. Oh, let me go back. So if you're not familiar with the West Bank, I've blown up a picture of the West Bank here. That's a blow up of this area right here. So the West Bank has 3 different areas of control, if you will. So there's civilian control and there's security control. The dark green areas of the West Bank are areas that have full Palestinian control of security and civil control. Okay? The areas in light green have full Palestinian civil control, but joint Israeli-Palestinian military control. And the areas in white are areas that have full Jewish or full Israeli security and civil control. So that's the West Bank. Same thing kind of with Gaza down here. You see the dark area, kind of hard to see on that map, and you see some of the settlements and whatnot. So that's modern Israel today. Modern Jerusalem today looks like this. And if you were at my classes 4 months ago, whenever it was that I was talking, you've seen this slide already. But modern Israel looks like this. It's made up of 4 quarters: Jewish quarter, Armenian, Christian, and Muslim quarters. And you can go walk around there today. It's really cool. Now that things have settled down in the Middle East, I'm hoping maybe we can travel back over there before too long. One of the cool things you can do is a North Ramparts Walk. You can buy a ticket here in the Armenian Quarter at David's Tower and walk around the walls of Jerusalem. That's pretty cool. You can walk all the way over to almost the northern wall of the Temple Mount. And you can look down on the city, and there's so many different things. If you were at my class, I showed you a bunch of different pictures that I took from this Ramparts Walk. You can see a bunch of Jews running around with weapons, which is kind of cool. You can see a bunch of the walls of Jerusalem, how it's built on bedrock. That's kind of cool. You can look down on the activity of the city. You can see a bunch of stuff on top of the walls of Jerusalem, on top of Jerusalem that's going on that nobody knows about. I mean, there's soccer fields up there. There's kids playing. We had Muslim kids, I assume, approach us and try to talk to us and whatever through a fence as we were walking along this Ramparts Walk. They were off the soccer field. We see satellite dishes up there and refrigerators and just stuff. It's really kind of amazing. There's also a southern Ramparts Walk. Get the same ticket and go around almost to this southwestern corner of the Temple Mount. Very cool. Now, as we go along in our studies, we will see several cities that are renamed. So when I talk about Stratos Tower, it depends on the time of time I'm talking about. If I'm talking about before Herod renamed it to Caesarea, you just have to know that Stratos Tower and Caesarea are the same thing. They've just been renamed. So there are a bunch of cities that were renamed Caesarea. Caesarea Philippi used to be Panias. Panias was originally named after the Greek god Pan, and then it was renamed by Herod Philip II after Augustus, Caesar Augustus. Stratos Tower renamed Caesarea by Herod the Great. Caesarea Maritima to keep it separate from Caesarea Philippi, and then the other Caesareas got named there. Samaria, renamed Sebast by Herod the Great. So if you read in the literature about Sebast, that's the same as Samaria. Remember, Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel back in Old Testament times. Judah in the south, Israel in the north, Samaria the capital, Jerusalem the capital. Samaria the capital in the north, renamed Sebast. The Sea of Galilee is known as Kinnereth in Hebrew. That evolved over time to become Gennesaret, we read in Luke chapter 5. So just remember that cities get renamed all the time, and it keeps it more difficult to keep up with when they do that. In the book, I've got a bigger table than this, but I pulled out some of the values of this. I wanted to see how far it would take me to walk from one place to another. So you see a lot of tables of the number of miles between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, Jerusalem and Caesarea and whatever. I decided to change that into how long it would take to walk. Because if you were just a regular old Jewish person living back then, that's the way you would travel, is you would walk places. Well, it turns out Jerusalem is really close to Bethlehem. It'd take you about an hour to walk there, maybe less. I mean, sure enough, today you go to the Middle East, as we traveled from Jerusalem, it took us longer than an hour to get there because we had to go through the security of the West Bank. The Jewish person would come on board and check us all out and all this, and we'd finally go over to Bethlehem and see what there was in Bethlehem. And then we would, I have a story of getting left in the West Bank, but that'll be some other time. Shelley and I were left over in the West Bank, which was pretty exciting, actually. And then the bus finally came back and got us. But anyway, so it's a very short walk from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. Some of these other walks, like from the Sea of Galilee to Herodium, was a pretty good walk. It'd take you about 23 hours. Now, all these are straight line distances. I didn't take into account that you'd have to walk around hills and mountains and boulders and whatever. These are straight line distances, but I wanted to get kind of a feel for how long it took to get there. Interestingly enough, we were standing on the Mount of Olives one day and looking down at Jerusalem, the land of milk and honey, and back behind us was the Judean desert. So I could turn around and look at the Judean desert and see it wasn't the land of milk and honey. It really was desert. But I was standing looking at Jerusalem, and I looked over to my left, and I saw Herodium. Now, if you don't know what Herodium is, it's a giant hill in the West Bank where Herod the Great was buried. He had a tremendous complex there at Herodium, and they found his sarcophagus there. I think it was his sarcophagus. They found a bathtub that he used there. And we were at the Israel Museum. They actually had a special exhibit. They just found it a couple of years or something earlier than when we were there, back in 2013. But I could look over and see that. So the walking distance from Jerusalem to Herodium is about 3 hours. So it kind of gives you a feel for how far things are apart in the Middle East. All right, I think we can get through a couple more slides. So Judea versus Iudaea versus Coele-Syria, what does it all mean? So Judah was one of the sons of Israel, or Jacob. There's bell number 1, from whom the 12 tribes came. Now 10 of his sons were 10 of the 12 tribes, and 2 of his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were the other 2 tribes. But Judah was one of the sons of Jacob, and he became one of the 12 tribes called Judah. Wow, that's amazing. Okay? Judah became Judea. After they returned from the Babylonian captivity toward the end of the Old Testament, Judah became Judea. The region of Judea became the Roman province of Judea in 63 BC when Pompey took over. We will cover that history when he comes in and takes over and why he took over. In AD 6, after Herod Archelaus was banished, we'll talk about why he was banished and some of that detail later on. But in AD 6, when he was banished, the Roman prefects took over, and when they did that, the regions of Judea, that we're familiar with in the Old Testament, Samaria, and Idumea, they were combined into a larger Roman province called Judea, and that's often referred to as Judaea. We see it in the literature start popping up as Judea, or as the Romans called it, Iudaea. Now, I may be mispronouncing that, I don't know, but it starts with an I. So Iudaea. Iudaea was the same as Judea, which was the same as these three provinces that got combined into one province at the time. Coele-Syria means hollow Syria, and it describes the same area during the Ptolemaic and Seleucid times that we will cover. Palestine and the Levant. Palestine is generally thought of as the regional land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. The genesis of the term is Egyptian, goes back to about the 12th century BC, and we see also Herodotus talk about that in the 5th century BC. Herodotus, he died about the same time the Old Testament ended. So the word Palestine existed for a long time. Actually, I was given a talk a couple of years ago now, I guess maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and someone had issue with me bringing up Palestine. And they thought it was a more modern term. Well, it is, and I'll explain that in just a minute. But the word Palestine itself is pretty ancient. It goes back 12th century BC, 5th century BC, where the Greeks started using. The derivative of the word Palestine is from Philistines. And Hadrian, when we had the Bar Kokhba revolt, which I don't cover in my book, but the Bar Kokhba revolt, Hadrian basically drove as many Jews out of Israel as he could, and out of Coele-Syria, Judea, and replaced the name with Palestine. During the Old Testament, the people there consisted of 12 tribes of Israel. By the New Testament, it consisted of Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. Up until the late 1800s, the term Palestine was always used as a regional term, not a people. A Palestinian was one born in that region. Whether you were a Christian, Muslim, Jew, atheist, whatever, you were a Palestinian. The word Palestinian people, best I can tell, correct me if I'm wrong, but the word Palestinian people came along in about 1964 with the organization of the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. And Palestinian people became a popular vernacular for the right of return of the Palestinian people to the land of Israel. The Levant is the land bordering the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, much of modern Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan, and its first use dates to the 15th century AD. Last chart. Assyria, Syria, and Samaria. Assyria is the name of the empire that existed in the Old Testament times, named after Assur, its capital city. They conquered and assimilated the northern kingdom of Israel in 721 BC, and they fell to the Babylonian Empire about 110 years later. Syria. Now, in my book, I've got a fairly simple explanation of where the word Syria comes from. I have an errata on my website you can go see and see that I've fixed that. I've changed that to where I do a better job of explaining where the word Syria comes from. It doesn't appear in the Old Testament. It does start appearing in the Intertestament, in the Apocrypha, and we see that it is probably first used as a corruption of Assyria. In the New Testament, it talks about the name Syria comes about because of Pompey renaming that Roman province in 62 BC. Samaria, last word of the day. Samaria was named from the original owner of the hill on which the Samaritan temple would be built. Now, remember, Samaria was the capital of Israel, Jerusalem the capital of Judah. So Samaria was named from this original owner. It was populated by the Assyrians. When the Assyrians came in and conquered, I told you this last week, they would pick people up, and they would take them and they'd transport them somewhere else, and they would take these people from over here, wherever, and they'd pick them up, and they would put them in where Israel used to be. And they started intermarrying with Jews, and that's why the Jews in Jerusalem, in the southern part of this land there, started thinking of Samaritans as half-breeds, because they were kind of, they were married between, they were a combination of these heathens, as they looked at it, coming in and intermarrying with the Jews in the region. So that's why there was much enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans. All right, next week we will pick up there, and we are done with chapter 1, really, for the most part. I have pulled some information from different chapters also, but next week we'll pick up with chapter 2, and hopefully we'll cover that in a week. We'll see. Thank y'all for being here, and thank y'all for paying attention. Y'all have a good day.